What the future will bring, no man can say. But one fact is certain. Mankind stands at the crucial crossroads of history, the threshold of a new era, the atomic age.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia. Since their respective publications in 1865 and 1871, there have been over 23 adaptations of Lewis Carroll, aka Charles Dodgson's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and Through the Looking Glass. The spring of 1949 saw the release of a seventh adaptation, a British-French co-production directed by Dallas Bauer, produced and effectively co-directed by the stop-motion pioneer Lou Bunin. With versions produced simultaneously in both the English and French language, the 1951 theatrical release of the English language cut in the United States was overshadowed by Walt Disney's own feature-length animated adaptation. What's more, it wouldn't find its way into legal distribution in the United Kingdom until 1985. Apparently one of the few earlier adaptations of Carroll's work to adhere to the tact of its being a social satire. British distributors were wary of the film's caricature of Queen Victoria. In the film, Alice's fantasy is contextualized inside a Wizard of Oz-style frame narrative told to her by Dodgson, in which certain characters in Alice's fantasy seem to correlate with live-action actors in the real world, and where Queen Victoria is, obviously, represented by the Queen of Hearts. Implicit in the fantasy segments of the film is that they are representing veiled statements against stuffy convention and authority that the author is too meek to express in his real life.
Lecturer in mathematics, Mr. Charles Dodgson.
Otherwise known as Lewis Carroll. I've read some of your verse in the Illustrated News. Charming, perfectly charming. What a lovely day for croquet and for chopping off a few heads.
For our purposes, Alice in Wonderland is primarily notable as being the first recorded screen credit of one Irving, who was an art director on the film and would soon find himself in demand, along with Jack Rabin, as a creator of special effects for low-budget science fiction films throughout the 1950s. Rabin himself had been working in Hollywood since the 30s, beginning first as an animator before going on to specialize in visual effects. Bloch's long-term collaboration with Rabin began in 1950, the latter as special effects creator overseeing the former as a matte painter on Kurt Newman's Rocketship X-M.
X minus 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
The story goes that Rocketship X-M was the result of two separate space exploration films being pitched to independent producer Robert L. Lippert around the same time. One by Newman, who had been a director of standard B-movie fare since the 30s and was anxious to helm a more ambitious, fantastic project about a lunar expedition, and another by Rabin, whose own project, entitled, strangely enough, Destination Moon, had languished in development over creative disagreements with his partners, and was now all but kaput thanks to Hungarian-American producer George Pal's acquisition of the title for his own film. With a lengthy production process and delayed theatrical release owing largely to its pioneering special effects and, thus, its ballooning budget, with an extensive publicity campaign by its distributor Eagle Lion Films, and with significant contributions by Robert A. Heinlein to the screenplay, Destination Moon was to be one of Hollywood's first forays into science fiction as a serious-minded, prestigious genre. Eager to quickly capitalize, Lippert combined Newman and Rabin's pitches, though a threatened lawsuit from George Pal forced the filmmakers to change the story's destination from the moon to Mars. Lippert rushed his competitor into production for less than 1/6 the budget of Pal's film. In one of the great sucker punches of Hollywood exploitation history, Rocketship X-M would begin principal photography on February 2nd and premiere on May 26th of the same year, a full month before Pal's Destination Moon. Though its screenplay is credited to Kurt Newman with additional dialogue by Orville H. Hampton, Rocketship X-M is actually written by blacklisted author Dalton Trumbo, appropriately and in stark contrast to Pal's utopian vision of space travel in which independent entrepreneurship is instrumental in leading mankind into the new and glorious space age. Rocketship X-M presents not only a grim vision of the perils of space travel, but also an allegory informed by anxiety over nuclear proliferation and the arms race. In Newman's film, an intended expedition to the moon actually leads a 5-person astronaut crew to the surface of Mars by mistake, and what is literally a journey away from the Earth turns out to be a metaphorical journey into the Earth's future. The astronauts find the Martian world inhabited by barbaric mutant troglodytes, as well as the ruins of a once thriving advanced civilization now ravaged by dangerous levels of radiation.
Ironic, isn't it? The mind, man, wherever you encounter it, Earth or Mars, the highest attainments of human intellect, always diverted to self-destruction. Perhaps the entire surface of the planet is one vast ruin, like this. What a lesson here for our world. One blast, thousands of years of civilization wiped out. Atomic age to Stone Age.
The substance of Rocketship X-M is not as simple as an anti-nuclear message either. Again, in contrast to Pal's film, space travel is not presented as a visionary mission to uplift mankind, but a distraction from our terrestrial crises. In the dichotomy between the two primary classifications of the post-war's impending technological moment, the space age and the atomic age, the filmmakers effectively present these two terms as obverse of one another, symbolically conflating the development of rockets for space exploration and the development of rockets for intercontinental warfare in a manner typical of elite Cold War hysteria, which we outlined more extensively in our episode on War of the Satellites. The conclusion of the film is as dour as one can get, with the 3 remaining astronauts losing control of their rocket upon re-entry and crashing back down to Earth. More than simply one being a distraction from the other, the space age and the atomic age are comorbid, one deleteriously leading to escalation of the other, the ultimate outcome in our own destruction.
Shouldn't we wake him?
What good would it do?
None, you're right.
It's only seconds, darling. Try not to be afraid.
Floyd, I'm not afraid anymore. Something happened, like a great wave carrying us up, bearing us, protecting us.
Later in the 50s, Bloch and Rabin would continue to collaborate on low-budget science fiction and horror films, occasionally even developing and producing projects from their own concepts. Films featuring their work would include Flight to Mars in 1951, Captive Women in 1952, Invaders from Mars in 1953, World Without End in 1956, and perhaps most notably, Kronos, directed again by Kurt Newman, from 1957. But their first project together after the success of Rocketship X-M was another film for Lippert. Though the film began production under the title Night Without Stars, this would not be another foray into the perils of outer space, but rather through the travails of inner space. With the reliable specter of nuclear holocaust still weighing heavy on the minds of its creators, Bloch and Rabin now assuming expanded roles as producers, it is virtually impossible to consider Unknown World outside of the influence of Rocketship X-M. Indeed, the film functions virtually as an inverted remake of and companion piece to that film, extrapolating from Rocketship X-M the implicit critique of rocket science as complicit in mankind's atomic doom, and expanding it into the film's own explicit, overarching narrative theme. All but totally unbeloved now, and certainly not as well made as the previous film, Unknown World is nonetheless surprisingly compelling in its own critique of what I'll call technological escapism, or the figuring of fantastic, spectacular feats of science and engineering as holding the key to mankind's salvation, rather than representing merely a vehicle for his own complacency towards the accelerating and escalating crises of the modern world. To this end, I would argue that Unknown World, in both drama and form, comes to implicate contemporary science fiction itself as a largely reactionary genre.
For the people of the U.S., skilled in the uses of science and technology, the atomic age is profoundly significant. Across a continent enormous in its agricultural potential, Americans have drawn from the earth a rich bounty, have built great cities, have reared towers into the sky, have spun intricate networks of highways across the land. By the application of science, industry has grown increasingly productive, making possible a good way of life. With assurance, Americans look with an abiding faith to the future. For many, citizen and scientist alike, atomic energy means the promise of a more abundant life. But for many another, the atom is a threat, an evil promise, the paralyzing panic of our time. Thus, to answer the perplexing question of the atom and its implications, the people have turned their attention to the forum of public affairs, have sought to search out realities, to find the facts, or to listen to men of science.
Predicting trends in low-budget sci-fi to come, Unknown World opens with reams of library footage intercut with original footage establishing our principal cast of characters and their mission. Already more interesting than future attempts, however, this 10-minute sequence is presented explicitly in the style of a newsreel that, rather than simply stating exposition, manages to both establish character and motivation, as well as immediately introduce complication. Our principal characters are the concerned members of a member-funded scientific foundation called the Society to Save Civilization, led by the geologist Dr. Jeremiah Morley. Morley, played by the uncredited blacklisted actor Victor Killian, is certain that the development of thermonuclear weapons will inevitably lead to a mass extinction event in the near future, and is therefore determined to raise funds in order to conduct subterranean expeditions deep beneath the Earth's surface in order to find a viable asylum for the last vestiges of civilized human society. Assisting him in this endeavor are Otto Waldis as geophysicist and German-Jewish expat Dr. Max A. Bauer, Tom Handley as metallurgical engineer Dr. James Paxton, Dick Kogan as soil conservationist Dr. George Coleman, Jim Bannon as marine veteran and explosive expert Andrew Andy Ostengard, and, last but not least, Marilyn Nash as Dr. Joan Lindsay, an award-winning medical doctor and, as the newsreel narrator prestigiously informs us, an ardent feminist. As the newsreel continues, we learn that the STSC is unable to raise suitable funds either publicly or through private investment for their endeavors, and is thus forced to terminate their efforts.
And what of its leaders? Of Professor Jeremiah Morley and his enthusiastic colleagues. Where were they headed after a year of devotion to a lost but spectacular cause? To newsreel reporters, Dr. Morley had only this to say.
We have no plans. We have no hope.
Better stand by, Frank. We may want to run that again. Well, gentlemen, what do you think?
It's like asking a man what he thinks of his own obituary.
In an interesting twist, apparently inspired by Citizen Kane, we discover that the newsreel is actually being privately projected for the benefit of the now extinct STSC by its producer, Wright Thompson, played by Bruce Kellogg. Thompson also happens to be the playboy son of the news mogul who has been making the STSC out to be a bunch of cranks for the better part of a year. So despite Thompson's overtures of sympathy for the group, they are suspicious of his motives. Nonetheless, Thompson makes Morley an offer he can't refuse: full unquestioned funding of his expedition in exchange for the right to tag along. At first glance, this way of opening the film doesn't appear to be doing much. What we have is a fairly straightforward introduction to all of the setting, the characters, their motivations and goals, all contextual details delivered in a concise and efficient manner before we fast forward to the spectacle and adventure that we are actually there to see. But from the moment of that harsh cut between Morley's last line, that "we have no hope" in the newsreel, to this jarringly triumphalist theme music of the newspaper, we already know we're dealing with a work that is both tonally and dramatically distinct from most contemporary science fiction, as well as from most later entries in the genre. What is emphasized very subtly in this cut is the stark contrast between the very serious, existentially worrisome subject of the piece and the complacent mechanism through which the subject is presented in a narrative form. Despite the fact that the ending of it is that we have no hope, the music implies that there is an ongoing, happy ending. To supplement that tension, we are then presented with Morley's direct assertion that there are powerful interests behind the medium that are invested in, as he phrases it, crucifying unpopular ideas that challenge conventional narratives. Inseparable from that assertion, and also expressed explicitly at the opening of the newsreel, is the contextualization of these fringe ideas within a dominant ideological narrative that emphasizes technological escapism, as I have defined it, emphasizing the exploding productivity of American industries, both industrial and agricultural, thanks to the application of the sciences and engineering. With atomic energy as the latest and most modern development, and though the newsreel ostensibly expresses sympathy for the existential concerns of the STSC and their supporters, the piece even being entitled Civilization versus the Atom, these concerns are inevitably presented as a marginal contrast to an overarching sense of, quote, the good way of life provided by America's largely unfettered industry and the apparent assurance and abiding faith of citizen and scientist alike in a future in atomic energy. That Morley's concern is not necessarily with the abstracted concept of the atom, in quotes, as this mystifying source of both great progress and great disaster, but specifically with atomic weapons, which are material and have no positive application, is totally flattened and obscured in the piece. Though in some ways presenting what we might call a fair and balanced look at tensions regarding both atomic weapons and atomic energy, the piece in itself becomes about the failure of the STSC to attain funding because the mission of the group, to build a massive subterranean and submersible vehicle to plumb the depths of the Earth, is received as an impractical and non-productive application of science and resources. The implicit framing of the STSC as a consortium of fringe, hysterical elites is reinforced by their attempts to crowdfund the expedition on their own, emphasizing the gulf between their humanitarian project and the more parochial concerns of the general public. Going a step further, in the shadow of the virtually unquestioned good represented by the practical application of science and technology in terms of productivity, i.e. capital accumulation and wealth, anything like the STSC proposal, which is inherently and explicitly humanitarian, and is just so unconcerned with questions of productivity, capital, and wealth, is implicitly framed as pointless at best and intellectually masturbatory at worst, if only because it seeks precisely to interrupt narratives of technological escapism. The issue is not even so much whether these are overall factual representations of events, or if there is, as Morley asserts, a concerted effort being made by the newsreel's wealthy owner to disparage the SDSC and their positions. The issue is that the medium itself is all but programmatically designed to mystify and obscure the specific threat of the nuclear arms race to reflect ideological investment in narratives of productivity to the exclusion of others, and to reinforce the complacency of a mass consumer audience once it is confirmed for them that there is no countervailing movement at a political, private, or popular level to deal with the existential threat of nuclear weapons. It's impossible to not consider Unknown World in light of George Pal's Destination Moon, a foundational work of technological escapism for America's post-war cinema. It's just as impossible to not consider it in light of Rocketship X-M as the anti-escapist, anti-utopian counterpoint to that film. Even still, Unknown World goes even further than Rocketship X-M by specifically doing much less. As with the preceding film, a significant amount of the plot complication of Unknown World is given to the logistics of new technology and exploration, determining the safest pathways underground to avoid lava flow and poison gas, finding sources of water when the onboard supply accidentally becomes polluted, etc. Even so, there are no mutant cavemen, no dinosaurs or monsters, no lost civilizations. Even when the surviving crew finally reaches their veritable Shangri-La some 1,700 miles below sea level, the moment of dramatic complication comes not from some cataclysmic earthquake or flood, but from the failure of an experimental group of rabbits to reproduce fertile offspring.
Well, how many boy rabbits and how many girl rabbits, huh? What's the matter? Joan, what's the matter?
They're dead. They're all born dead.
I can't understand it. Why? Why?
There must be some cause, some biological reason.
Inevitably, Unknown World becomes conflated with other examples of Lippert Pictures' catalog of low-budget sci-fi explorer films, particularly Lost Continent from the same year or Burt I. Gordon's King Dinosaur. This conflation is unfair, however, because, first of all, Unknown World, neither in its publicity nor in its opening moments, ever promises more than it can deliver. There is no confusing that, more so than any of its other contemporaries, this film is not a true adventure story, but an earnest attempt at an adult-oriented, hard sci-fi with a focus on character and current social themes rather than spectacle. For sure, the film is critically undermined by director Terry O'Morse's decided lack of atmospheric sensibility. When aboard the subterranean vehicle, the cyclotram, he either neglects or lacks the ability to communicate an adequate sense of claustrophobia. A neglect or lack that is complemented by his similarly plain depiction of the yawning, black expanses of the deep underworld, portrayed by a combination of studio spaces, the Bronson Caves in Griffith Park, California, and the Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. Frankly, even if Unknown World weren't terribly interesting, though I'd argue it is terribly interesting, viewers could be forgiven for neglecting it due to Morse's disastrously impersonal directing style alone, which goes a long way to alienate the spectator from an already rather one-dimensional cast. That being said, even this impersonal approach contributes to some of the film's charm. I can't help but recall author Bill Warren's criticism of Roger Corman's War of the Satellites, that it's a film where things are always on the verge of happening, but never actually do. Unlike your King Dinosaur or Lost Continent, where sequences are plainly protracted to pad out the running time and complications arise for the purposes of puerile spectacle, but are otherwise totally divorced from the interpersonal drama between characters, Unknown World is an almost deliberately boring film that, ironically, has the effect of accurately representing for the spectator, despite the objectively fantastic scenario, the profound slowness and lack of bombast that is the actual substance of the vast majority of not only the sciences, but also so-called exploration. On the one hand, all dramatic complications are presented as minuscule in the context of the vast, ceaseless trudging expedition of the cyclotram downward. On the other hand, the mission is so simple that the absence of spectacular complication lulls the spectator into an unconventional moodiness and pessimism. At worst, and it appears most of the time, this moodiness simply results in boredom and rejection of the film as a cheap waste of time. But I genuinely think there's a space for the pessimistic moodiness of the film to provide the right viewer with a unique and rewarding cinematic experience. In the relative absence of spectacle, not just because of the lack of budget, but as a deliberate narrative tact, Unknown World is quietly nuanced and polemical.
It's funny. When we first got here, I felt a sort of exaltation. Now I feel depressed. I don't know why.
The oxygen content is adequate.
I know. But I too feel suffocated. Maybe it's the unreality of this place.
You know, once when I was working in the Holland Tunnel, I got cut off from my crew for 10 hours. I felt this way then.
I think I know what it is. It's loneliness. It's a feeling of a person away from people. I felt it on the top of a mountain in Tibet, in the jungles, and on the Arabian desert. It's like the last cord tying you with humanity has been cut.
It's more than that. People have dignity only in relation to many other people. Alone, a man is as useless as any rock out there.
No, you're both talking nonsense.
Being a film about an insular group of characters on an expedition that is always on the verge of happening, but where nothing ever substantially happens, Unknown World as a dramatic narrative is primarily concerned with boredom, isolation, and loneliness. Before the expedition begins, its cast of characters are already isolated from the real world in multiple ways. They are all privileged and or highly educated individuals with an exceptionally specialized range of expertise, and in the application of their privilege and knowledge, they are only united by an existential concern that only further isolates them from both dominant ideological trends in politics and economy, as well as from popular, parochial concerns. Spurred to action, they find themselves on the course that now literalizes their figurative isolation from humanity, and thus serves to clarify their fundamental dysfunction. Though ostensibly the outlier of the group, Kellogg's thrill-seeking Thompson, in turn, clarifies the myopic direction of the group towards increasing isolation and dysfunction through its natural corollary in a figure who lacks their same degree of existential dread, but is just as divorced from the real world as it is participated in and dealt with by the vast majority of people. While the STSC is seeking some kind of salvation for an otherwise hopeless civilization in the shadow of the mushroom cloud, and Thompson is solely seeking some libidinal event in exploration, they are unified in their disappointment in discovering that these are both fundamentally acts of escapism, which come at the cost of severing their last connection with the humanity that they are ostensibly seeking to reclaim or rescue from total oblivion. The message is pretty obvious. Rather than actually dealing with the political realities of the atomic age, the STSC has merely escaped into an ideological fantasy. But to put a finer point on it, the particular kind of escapism in which the group participates is in attempting to establish a utopia through advanced technology. Thus, this is specifically a technological escapism that is not altogether indistinct from that which is both propagated through dominant ideology, such as the abiding faith in the potential of the atom as expressed in the newsreel, as well as, in a metatextual sense, by popular science fiction. The substance of what I have inelegantly described as the film's quality of being deliberately boring is also, in a sense, anti-escapist. The descent of the cyclotram is a descent into a world of illusions, a mystifying reprieve from the anxieties and traumas of reality, not unlike Alice's Wonderland, although, in this case, revealed in a far more explicitly horrific and disappointingly nightmarish way. When the characters do reach their false paradise, it appears to us through Bloch and Rabin's special effects just as it does to the characters, as an arrangement of superficially majestic and magnificent images, qualities that, in the best-case scenario, are specifically crafted to provide us with sensual elation. But upon even the most basic interrogation and scrutiny, this artifice can never fill the fundamental lack in our spirit. It is very pretty and mystifying, and even full of potential in its own right. But the danger is always that our psyches, and our senses of ourselves in relation to the world around us, will become dependently bound up in this lifeless facade, compounding our atomization and depression even further, the darkness of the theater itself becoming like a cavern.
This is a strange kind of sand.
That's not sand, that's volcanic ash. The ash will make good fertilizer for our crops.
Crops? Let's face facts, Morley. This is a desert. The very word means deserted by life. And you talk about crops.
It can be irrigated. This country has everything. Water, soil, air, heat.
Yeah, you're forgetting one thing, though. No sunlight.
Science can adjust that. Crops can thrive without sunlight.
Perhaps. But can we?
You know what this means?
This new world. A haven for the dead.
This is the end of the line.
Then we can't stay here.
At least one generation could.
And after that, what?
The end of humanity.
That I won't accept.
Neither can you run away from facts.
The irony, of course, being that it is Morley who is running away from facts. His true motivations are laid bare as a matter of avoidance, not of principles. Believing that the world was doomed, he escaped into another of his own making, creating a story in his own head where fantastic technology and a utopian architecture rescues civilization from oblivion. Effortlessly, however, this technological escapism becomes a logical extension of fatalism. The destruction of civilization, of all life, really, becomes a convenient, self-fulfilling prophecy. And, of course, with the sterility of the rabbits as well as the budding romance between Lindsay and Thompson, this dysfunction is expressed in overtly sexual terms. Morley's love of science, of technology, of the logical mastery of nature, is not only indistinguishable from the dominant ideology of the world he avoids, it is also fundamentally a love of death, a desire for that final, morbid climax being the height of alienation. How Morley actually figures on managing and organizing a subterranean post-apocalyptic society is anybody's guess. But the often inherently authoritarian implications of utopianism is never far from the film's subtext, or even its basic text, even if the black comic joke is that Morley and his egg-headed consortium of nerds are ultimately too impotent and dysfunctional to impose any tyranny on anyone. After all, this is a story about alienation, and specifically a yawning alienation under the accelerating conditions of modernity, in which the connection of human beings as social animals to one another is being irrevocably lost. Utopianism allows us the chance to imagine scenarios in which these social bonds can be restored. But in its often insular appeal to the moral authority of a centralized ego, it can turn to a rejection of the social as always failing to measure up to higher ideals. The struggle to imagine and to organize a better society ultimately collapses under the neurotic preoccupation with a metaphysical discourse, with the fundamental moral inadequacy of people to that project. Kaufman's screenplay comes to express this contradiction explicitly in a scene where the characters are beginning to feel the malaise of their profound separation from other human beings. They come closer to the conclusion that, for all of their intellect, as Lindsay implies, they are as useless as rocks without other people, no matter how imperfect those people are. This communitarian impulse, that which tugs at the characters' hearts, beseeching them to return to the real world and deal with the reality of the Atom Age's existential uncertainty, finds its natural opposition in Paxton's more individually focused existentialism, more or less articulating Nietzschean concepts of the will to power and the Übermensch.
It's like the last cord tying you with humanity has been cut.
It's more than that. People have dignity only in relation to many other people. Alone, a man is as useless as any rock out there.
No, you're both talking nonsense. Nature doesn't influence man. Man influences nature. One man, one strong man, can change nature.
Oh, you're wrong, Dr. Paxton. It isn't one man. It's many men working together. Right, teacher?
Men together are no more than sheep. One man standing alone leads the way. Then the sheep follow.
Please, gentlemen.
Well, I'm
please.
embarrassed for all of you who call yourself scientists. Swayed by a self-indulgent young fool. I'm going ahead. I hope that by the time you catch up with me, the atmosphere will have cleared the cobwebs from your brains.
I'd better go with him. It isn't safe for a man to be alone down here.
Ah, he's all right. He's the leader type.
I'll go with them anyway. There wouldn't be leaders if there weren't sheep like me to be led.
Now, at the time of watching the film, I was rather stunned by what happened after this scene. The lulling effect of the film was really upon me, and the filmmakers levied the dramatic irony of what follows this mini-debate very effectively. In fact, it's probably the most effective part of the movie, being that it really doesn't terribly depend that much on either special effects or, thankfully, Morse's directing abilities. But now, when I think about it, I can't help but also appreciate how funny it is, and how serendipitously it seems to lend itself to our current moment of existential crisis in the US. Can you guess what happens to our self-styled Nietzschean strongman? The facts don't care about your feelings, authoritarianism is natural, and most people are sheep guy. He and the guy who follows him, they die of poison gas. Should have worn your mask, buddy.
Joan Lindsay, medical doctor and ardent feminist, who, for her research in biochemistry, was named winner of the annual award by the American Confederation of Women Scientists.
I suppose this is going to be a relatively short episode, so I just wanted to put aside a bit at the end to talk about my favorite part of the movie, which is Marilyn Nash's character, Dr. Joan Lindsay. Just out of the gate, it's extremely rare to even hear the word feminist used in a film during this period. Not that feminist isn't a concept that's in the ether, but usually when feminism is represented, especially in these types of low-budget B movies, it's presented in non-explicit terms that usually carry a degree of condescension or even outright negative misogynistic framing. I'm not even thinking in terms of something like Blood of Dracula either, where the villainess of the film is clearly supposed to be some sort of crazed feminist. I'm thinking more in terms of something like From Hell It Came, where, like, Tina Carver's character is, in that film, is this really driven professional woman who's rebuffing the male hero's advances, and this is framed as, like, some sort of personal dysfunction on her part that goes against something inherent in her nature that she only has or has adopted because of this modern woman ideal. Like, the framing you get from a lot of these films that really stress that they're female characters. Most often they're just a love interest. They really stress that feminism is basically like this tick that makes them frigid and somehow unable to live an emotionally or sexually fulfilling life. There are obvious exceptions, and a pretty good example of that is Faith Domergue's character in It Came From Beneath the Sea, but Unknown World deserves credit for not only not subscribing to this trope, but, just sort of casually treating feminism as a good thing. Because it means that a very talented woman is able to contribute more or less equally to a scientific project, and that's enough for everybody, and that should be enough. Part of it is just context, because the other thing that's conspicuously absent is the male hero just mercilessly hounding a woman until she's so worn down that she basically has to submit to him romantically. Obviously, there's still a romantic subplot in Unknown World, but like a lot of things, it's presented very casually. It doesn't take up an exorbitant amount of the drama. It's even more like background or scenery than anything, and more importantly, Thompson is actually pretty genteel and fairly non-aggressive in pursuing Lindsay. He's clearly not just after her. He respects her on a basic level, so he's able to express his interest in her and even, intimate that he's kind of confident that she returns his affections without her needing to say it, but still be confident in himself, which is great because it also makes him look good because his masculinity isn't solely defined by overpowering someone else. But obviously the important thing isn't how he looks, really. It's just kind of nice to watch a scene like this and feel like there's no part of it where Dr. Lindsay is supposed to be falling for Thompson because he's being aggressive and possessive towards her. Instead, it's because, yeah, she herself is a well-rounded character who has her own private desires and feelings, but also isn't exclusively defined by her prospective relationship with a guy.
How are those burns coming along?
Good as new. How are you, Doc?
Oh, I'll get by.
Here.
What's it for?
Does it have to be for something? Does everything have to be functional? It's a good luck ring. Saved my life in Tibet. Here, take it.
Why give it to me?
Haven't you ever been romanced before?
Not 900 miles below sea level.
Then it's about time. If there were any flowers around here, I'd pick them for you.
There's a highly scientific theory which states that if any man and any woman are cast away anywhere for any length of time, sooner or later they think they were in love. That's what's happened to you.
If that theory has any value, it should apply to you. Does it?
No.
Well, I guess I need a little more time. We'll talk about it later.
Now, obviously, there's still some problematic aspects of that scene, like Thompson still doesn't really take no as a genuine answer, and there's still that aspect of sexism to it, where it's implied that Lindsay is just sort of naturally and unconsciously drawn to Thompson just because they're a man and a woman in an extraordinary semi-isolated circumstance. But then the other thing about it is that they actually have her literally say that the two of them are probably just developing feelings because of those extraordinary circumstances. That's the thing about it. Implicitly, the character is saying that there's nothing much that's special about their chemistry. That rather than taking the tact of rejecting arguments of certain natural qualities of the sexes, she's saying more or less that because it is natural, it's therefore not really worth the time of investing a particular amount of attention to it. And the fact of the matter is, the film doesn't really invest that much attention to it. Despite what he says, Thompson only once really attempts to romance her again, and again, the act is subverted rather ingeniously. Okay, so what happens is that at a certain point after Paxton and Cole have died, the rest of the crew find themselves in an underwater lake where there's enough land to support basically a campsite for them. There's clean water, there's food, you could potentially even have a small type of survivalist community there. Anyway, at one point, Thompson discovers some calcium carbonate and some plaster of Paris, the former looking like oysters' pearls, and the latter looking like a kind of exotic flower.
Hey! Look what I found!
They're cave pearls.
Cave pearls? How much they worth?
Calcium carbonate.
Calcium carbonate. Well, how about this?
Sulfate of lime. Plaster of Paris.
Professor, you take the romance out of everything. Here you are, Doc. 2 souvenirs from Hades, vacation land of the underworld.
Thank you. Back home, I'll be the envy of every kid on the block.
I'm not so sure, Joe. Take a cave pearl into the sunlight, turns gray and ugly.
And the flower?
It'll crumble to dust.
What kind of a place is this? Flowers that crumble to dust in your hands. Stones that look like pearls. Nature sure a practical joker.
I suppose you could have done better?
10 million years, I couldn't have done worse.
I love Lindsay's line there about being the envy of every kid on the block, even before Thompson's entire gesture is, once again, demonstrated to be very scientifically a practical joke of nature with no special value outside of this very specific context. She herself lets him know she considers the gift flatteringly juvenile. There's also a lot to be said there about how that scene fits into a reading of the film being allegorical of cinema as an artifice. And that's more or less where the overt romancing ends. For the rest of the film, Thompson and Lindsay are just, I don't know, kind of just cute to one another, you know, like flirty. Maybe I'm taking too much out of this, but I really do think that the love angle going through Unknown World is the perfect illustration of how it's a movie where something is always on the verge of happening but never does. The chemistry between Thompson and Lindsay is always on the verge of sparking, but it never really does. They become closer, but again, if anything, both characters just kind of come to embrace their knowledge of it as a natural formality and not as some sort of profound statement. They spend much more time of the film focusing just on the mission at hand and their ability to survive. There's no explosion of sexual tension. Thank God, there's no part where Thompson just takes Lindsay in a vice-like grip and forcibly kisses her like he's trying to press both their teeth through their gums. The romance never happens. It's just kind of is. And, you know, from my point of view, that's actually really refreshing and kind of sublime in a way, and fits perfectly with the film's overall anti-escapist theme. Because it works. Avoiding escapism doesn't mean avoiding emotion. If anything, not entertaining escapist fantasies only makes a kind of sublime experience of emotion feel more genuine or authentic. Because it's not really about achieving or reaching some kind of resplendent, mystifying moment. It's about being in the moment and allowing this to help us overcome our respective senses of alienation. The result is that Dr. Lindsay gets to be an ardent feminist lady professional who is never once presented as frigid because she's a professional or a scientist or a feminist. She is just a fully embodied person as a character and not just the girl on the team. In fact, there's not even really a scene in the movie where they rescue her. Nobody carries her shit. She kind of holds her own throughout the movie. It's pretty great. Then again, most of the other people around her are really old and fragile themselves, so maybe it's just kind of logical. If anything, her problem ends up being, and this is kind of just stupidly shoehorned in near the end, I'll give you that, but if anything, her problem, the thing that does make her isolated, alienated, even frigid, problematic term, it's not her inability to accept, like, her natural feelings towards a strong, handsome, suave guy. It's the fact that engaging in this whole escapist adventure, this whole project of avoidance, tellingly with all of these mostly older men, she realizes that her problem is that she's actually avoiding having a fight with the patriarchy.
I've always run away. Climbing mountains. Trying to prove something. I don't know what.
I too ran away instead of fighting. And now I've run away again.
And I was always afraid I couldn't compete in a man's world. I think I want to go back and try again.
So, just a reminder, or really to clarify, Otto Waldes's character, Dr. Bauer, he's supposed to be someone who fled Nazi Germany. So, like, the filmmakers seem to have composed a scenario in which Dr. Lindsay's bravery in going back to compete in a man's world is like a German Jew going back to fight the Nazis. Okay, so it's also being compared with some rich boy learning that he has to, like, not spend his life drinking martinis and watching the sunrise and actually help people, but, you know, whatever. It was 1951, small victories.